Thank you so much, Jafra and Paul. That was really interesting. I hold my hands up. It's a topic that I haven't given sufficient thought to in the past, but your presentation was really thought-provoking. Thank you very much for that. Guys, we'll just move straight on. Well, no need for 7 minutes of guilt because I'm up next and I'm unprepared. So it's absolutely fine to take a little time. Essentially, for this next session, I'm going to present a brief update on a project that we've been working on for a while. When I initially suggested doing this, I hoped that I would have perhaps a little more of an update than I have, but organising this event took a little bit more time in terms of kind of pulling things together, and so maybe pull time from some other things. So I'm maybe not quite as far ahead in the preparations as I'd hoped to be, but not to worry. Here we go. I'm going to just share my screen. Can you guys see that okay?
Yes.
Great. So basically what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes, and this is just going to be a short and quite informal update on our plans to develop an open access sport and exercise science research methods primer. So some of you will already be aware that this is a project that we've been working on. It's also something that will be discussed more tomorrow in the publications talk, but STORK is keen to develop a library of open access books on various topics related to sport and exercise, science, health and movement related research that, in keeping with our kind of overall overarching principles, will all be made open access and available to anyone who wants to see them. The idea for this particular book, it's kind of gone through various iterations. It started out as, oh, it would be interesting to have a series of kind of short informal articles or blog type articles on various research methods topics. And then we're like, well, that's not really enough. Maybe we could have a special edition of the journal focusing on various aspects. And in the end, we realized that what we're talking about was a full-on textbook. So essentially what we are visualizing here, I'd just like to stress, before I go much further, these are ideas and thoughts and suggestions, but we really want this to be a community-led project, and we are still in the development stages. So if anyone disagrees with what I'm saying, please feel very free to put it in the chat or to drop me an email after, because this is the vision and the ideas, but we're actively seeking feedback. What I sometimes feel when searching for materials, for example, for my students, is that a lot of the best stuff available is sometimes in other areas. And I think, or it goes quite deep dive. And I think that sometimes it's almost like you need quite a decent level of knowledge just to be able to get into more depth, to be able to read what's already there. I think it can be quite intimidating to, say, pick up an article talking about things like, I don't know, para-analysis, conceptual issues and defining questions, because the terminology, it tends to be quite specific, the concepts are quite complicated, and I just feel like we're almost missing a step there for people to kind of get in, to just get the broad concept solid in their head, so that they're able then to progress to more deeper dive and in-depth considerations. I also feel like a lot of the material is sometimes outside of our research area, which I think makes it very difficult for students sometimes to contextualize what it is that they're reading. If you're getting, for example, there's some great work in psychology, we know has some great work, but I work in sports nutrition and exercise physiology. The examples that are provided, the terminology that's used, it's not really, it's difficult to transfer. So what we are thinking is of developing this sport and exercise science research methods primer. We want it to be at quite a foundational level. So it's going to act as an introduction. It's not going to be too advanced. We want to be community led, and I'll talk a little bit more about the practicalities of how that might happen. Moving on, we wanted to be contemporary, to deal with kind of emerging issues. For example, I hadn't really thought of it before, but perhaps Jafra and Paul, we need sections on how to go about including, being more inclusive in how we approach sport and exercise science, and also other topics that we've discussed today, issues around so question research practices, etc. Things that maybe are being discussed much more today than they were previously, and we'd like to make sure to include them. It's going to be an online book, and what we hope that will do is to bring quite a bit of flexibility, because of course different aspects of the research process, they all link into each other, they all build on each other. So I think it would be very useful to be able to embed links to go both forward and back. If a point comes up in a later part of the text that aligns to something or builds on something that was earlier, we want to be able to make it embed links so that people can move flexibly throughout it. And importantly, we want it to be open access and available to anyone who has an interest in learning more and advancing their research methods, knowledge and understanding. So the way we're visualizing this, the general format, we're hoping to take a sequential approach, kind of starting at the beginning and chapters aligning to different kind of steps in the research process, and for each chapter to really build on each other. So obviously that will take quite a bit of communication among authors. However, that's kind of the vision. What we'd really like to do is to include study examples in the earlier chapters and then use these to develop worked examples right throughout. So we've done a bit of this, had a few discussions about what are kind of representative study questions that will capture, if not all, at least most studies that we did. We figured that most questions will either want to describe something, explore something, or confirm something. So we'll provide worked examples in that context. For example, a question around describing the characteristics of a particular population, a question around exploring relationships between, for example, the population characteristics and physical activity behaviors, and a confirmatory question, which could be looping back to, say, James's talk earlier, does STORK juice really work or not, and in what context does it work? So we'd like to introduce these questions right at the beginning and then to carry them through, so that when we're trying to provide examples in different aspects of the book or different aspects of developing the research process, that we can link it back so that at the end you almost have a protocol for different types of questions, so that students can essentially follow the path that suits them most or that aligns most closely with what they're trying to do, and to try to contextualize. As I mentioned before, we really do want this to be written at quite a foundational level. So it's an introduction. So we're not assuming any prior knowledge. It's for people to enter in. However, we really want to be able to signpost to deeper dive materials. For example, we don't want to reinvent the wheel here. There's loads of great materials out here. What we want this is to be a primer to set people up to be able to get into those. So there will be a lot of signposting towards specific materials on the different topics. The way we're visualizing it as well is that it'll be kind of designed to be delivered throughout a typical kind of modular course. Now, I know obviously that varies hugely from university to university, but for example, a typical course might be approximately 12 weeks. We've planned 9 chapters that it could essentially be account for 9 weeks, and then either repetition or case studies or whatever the lead wants to do. I'm well aware that many research methods courses might, for example, stretch across 2 modules, and the way we would suggest that it be delivered, obviously this is all optional for the lead of that course, but the way we suggest it would be delivered is that you go through the full book, the full process, and then you go back the way, and then you start going into the deeper dive signposted materials. Because I think sometimes you need to get to the end, you need to wrap your head around the overall process to be able to go back and think about the details. So that would be how we would suggest it would work. Brief overview of the chapter outline, how we're visualizing it. And once again, just to stress, these are ideas and very open to feedback. Chapter 1, we're going to aim to start out quite conceptual. Chapter 1 is going to be essentially an introduction to research and focus on defining the question. So we'll give a brief overview of prevailing philosophies. I don't know about you, but that wasn't something that was ever really mentioned when I kind of initially started thinking about research. And I sometimes feel that there's almost a gap in my way of thinking. If I could if I could describe my philosophy better, I could justify so many other aspects of my teaching, but I can't. So I will be looking forward to reading this when it's eventually ready. We'll talk about things like inductive versus deductive approaches to research. We'll discuss things like moving from verbal theories to formal theories to research questions. So building on some of that information that James Steele described earlier, about how to verbalize the theory that you're actually wanting to do. We'll talk about progressing from concepts to constructs, and we'll briefly get into different types of questions. And at this point, we'll, as I say, we'll provide those kind of examples of indicative questions within different broad categories. We'll move on then in chapter 2 from, once you've got your kind of question sorted out, to refining your research approach. We'll give an overview, observational, experimental, or secondary approaches to research. And here, obviously, look, we could have an entire chapter, entire book on each particular type of design, but we're visualizing more having, like, say, a table of commonly used study designs with definitions, and again, links and signposting to deeper dive materials for those who are interested. We will introduce here what might be the kind of the defining things you might want to consider if you're making the decision between quantitative, qualitative, or mixed approaches, and what might be most appropriate for your particular research question. And we'll give definitions and explain examples of quantitative and qualitative research approaches, along with how quality is usually determined in these approaches. For example, in quantitative, we usually talk about concepts like validity and reliability, whereas in qualitative, any qualitative researchers here, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because I know nothing about qualitative work, but I believe the concepts are more around credibility and trustworthiness would be the concepts that we kind of talked about when we were talking about high quality research there. Chapter 3, we'll start to move on from the kind of more conceptual information to getting more practical, and we'll start to talk about participant identification, selection, and recruitment. So we'll introduce some concepts such as generalizability. However, we'll also talk about more practical things like strategies to define and confirm eligibility criteria, to determining your sample size, thinking about concepts such as power or saturation, sampling and recruitment strategies. Again, I am aware there could be an entire book on all of these, but there are entire books on all of these. So what we want to do is to introduce these with the sport and exercise science specific examples with commonly used terminology, and then signpost off. And a thing that I think is particularly interesting to cover here is information on how important communication with participants actually is. I think sometimes we spend too much time designing a study and we forget to fully inform our participants about the practicalities of, I don't know, the importance of putting in full effort on every exercise test, reminding them about, obviously, things like informed consent are generally covered, but I don't know if we're always as good as we need to be about explaining the importance of really aligning with all of the research criteria. Moving on to chapter 4 then, if you've got your question, you've got your research approach, you've defined your population, we're going to start talking about data collection, and chapter 4 will focus on quantitative collection. We'll talk about things like control and standardization, various factors there. We'll link to previous concepts. For example, we'll have introduced already things like reliability and validity, but we'll start to talk about things like we'll also talk about power, things like the expected size of effect versus typical error of the test, and what that means for the decisions that you make around control and standardization. A really important one that I think for anyone that was at last week's ACSM meeting is things around real life applicability versus lab control. There's so many times when we want to investigate a particular effect, and so we try to control and standardize everything to isolate that effect, which of course makes sense, but then coaches and practitioners like, but no athlete would ever do that. So does this work in real life? And sometimes you have to make a trade-off between your real life applicability versus controlling your environment. I think that's important for students to consider. Also, a particularly important one that I think we should be trying to embed in all our students is appropriate data management procedures, to give advice, for example, on how to manage that, which is going to be one of the steps in creating reproducible workflows, so to make sure that they're kind of aware of that from the start and not just after they've collected their data. Chapter 5 and 6, chapter 6 will be data collection, but we'll be focusing more on qualitative aspects. And then chapter 6 and 7, we'll start to get into what to do with this data once you've actually collected it. Again, foundational, but a lot of signposting, introducing core concepts, for example, defining a general linear model and building from there. Just to reiterate, we'll be trying to build on these kind of representative questions and use them to provide contextualization right throughout. Chapter 8, we're talking about looking at approaches to secondary data analysis, for example, evidence synthesis, narrative reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analysis. And also we want to touch on analysis of secondary data sets there as well, and kind of different factors that may need to be considered there. And chapter 9, and the final chapter, is going to be around writing up publication dissemination. This will partially include kind of practical advice around writing up. What's the structure of a standard journal article? What type of information are you trying to get in to each part? What's the kind of the defining characteristics of a really nice introduction that kind of sets up and justifies your research question versus one that's maybe a bit more abstract in general. So the practicalities of writing. However, we'd also like to touch in there on the publication process and introduce some topical issues, for example, issues around publication bias and things that might impact, things that might cause students to stop and think, all right, maybe I can't just believe everything that I read, or as James Heathers clearly pointed out this morning, just because it's published doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be true. It's touched on several times throughout. And I think it'd be nice there to also talk about science communication and other forms of research dissemination in terms of tips, in terms of how to decide what kind of information you want to trust, and also what type of information you want to provide. Things like Instagram, Twitter, TikTok have really made maybe more superficial forms of information dissemination popular, which is not by any means always a bad thing, but it can be dangerous when complex concepts get boiled down to a simple message and perhaps misinterpreted. So I think that's something we'd like to touch on there to bring that awareness to students that it is important. If they're doing research, they need to disseminate it in a way that makes sense and actually reflects what they've done. So moving forward, I had hoped to be a little bit further in this by this talk, but as I say, sometimes time passes by. Within the next short while, we want to really focus on basically getting the content together. The idea would be we're going to get, hopefully, people to lead each chapter, people with specific expertise in each area. However, one thing I would like to stress to anyone who, when we invite people to take on individual chapters, we'd really like to encourage people to build a team to work on that, so that each chapter, is covering quite a lot of areas and is quite broad, that maybe you're building a small team to be able to touch on the different aspects. I would also encourage, obviously not mandate, but encourage chapter leads to include students on the writing of the different chapters, so that they can bring that perspective, as in what is it that they really need. In terms of kind of overall managing or organizing the project, myself and James Steele will be editing it, and we'll do our best to maintain communication and to try to ensure that link up between the different sections and between the different chapters. What we'd also like to do is to introduce a peer review for each chapter. We'll obviously read it and feedback ourselves. However, it would also be great to just get as many brains as possible working towards a kind of common goal. So we'd like to suggest having a peer review, not in a reject, accept, more just in a brainstorming, getting some external viewpoints on the different chapters. And within that peer review, again, I think it would be nice to make sure that a student is always reading it, to try to make sure that it's at the level. Obviously, we're going to vary quite a lot from, say, an undergrad student who's never even heard of these concepts to somebody later in their PhD. But at the same time, I think it is good to get at least some feedback. And from a technical point of view, it'll be supported by STORK. Zach Zenko, who will present here tomorrow, has already been through organising and leading the development of an open access textbook, The Essential Support and Exercise Psychology, which I think no matter what metric you want to use, is a great success in terms of it's really being well used. It had a great team on board, and I think we will be picking his brain quite a lot in terms of the practicalities of setting it up, assigning DOIs, typesetting, copywriting, etc. So basically, that's it. A brief whistle stop of what we're doing. I'm pretty much on my time now, so we're going to take just a 5-minute break before we go on to our last session of the day. But just a few questions there. Feel free to either pop them in the chat. I see that some are coming in here. I haven't read them yet. I don't have an ability to read two things at the same time. However, I'll have a look at the chat and respond to anything you have there now, but you'll also see my email address there. I think a lot of you you'll already have my email. You can get the email at STORK Kinesiology or send it directly to me there, and I'd be more than happy to hear any feedback that you have. That's me. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to go through these questions, but the only one I saw is the last comment. Eimear, there are plans to periodically update the content in the book. Sam, absolutely, but the first plan is just to create the content before we'll think about that will be the next step. We've nothing to update at the moment, but I'm hoping, Chris, great question. Again, sorry, I'm aware there's comments and questions beforehand. Chris, I had hoped to get contributors on board in the first part of this year, but time passed too quickly. That's going to be a focus in the next month or so, is to get the teams together. I will be accepting anyone who wants to be involved. Please feel free to jump out, and probably lots of you here will be getting emails in the near future to try and rope you in and bring you on board if obviously time and willingness allow. But what I would like to get starting on writing within the next month or so, with the aim of perhaps having at least chapter outlines by late this year, early next year, probably early next year, because we're already a month or two behind schedule. And then in 2023 to be going through the kind of the processes of editing, reviewing, updating, with hopefully having this done by the end of 2023.